So welcome to Plasma 2021 on Zoom. My name is Paige Sarlin and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Media Study here at University of Buffalo. This is a series sponsored by the Department of Media Study and the Office of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at University of Buffalo. And it's curated in collaboration with Liz Park from UB Art Galleries and Ekrem Serdar from Squeaky Wheels, who's our guest tonight. We are recording this talk, so if you don't wish to have your image or voice on the recording, please keep your camera and microphone muted. We begin with the acknowledgement that the land on which the University of Buffalo operates is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Tonight, I'm really thrilled to introduce Ekrem Serdar. Originally from Ankara, Turkey, Ekrem received his BA in Critical Studies and his MFA from the Department of Media Study here at UB. Since 2015, he's been the curator at Squeaky Wheels Film and Media Arts Center, Buffalo's own community media arts center that also has strong ties to media study faculty, students, and staff since it was founded here in 1985, not here at University of Buffalo, in Buffalo. At Squeaky, Ekrem is responsible for the organization's exhibitions, public programming, and artist residencies. Previously, he was a programmer with Experimental Response Cinema in Austin, Texas, which he co-founded. He is the recipient of a Curatorial Fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. He's an advisory member of Experimental Response Cinema and the FOL Cinema Society in Istanbul. His writing has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Millennium Film Journal, and Sharf Liller, among other publications. Ekrem is a tireless champion of artists and cultural workers. His commitment to providing and developing Squeaky Wheel as a platform for innovative, but also politically relevant and culturally pertinent voices has been remarkable to watch over the time since he's been curator there. Plasma has benefited tremendously from Ekrem's curatorial acumen, helping to connect us with tremendously interesting talent across a wide range of disciplines, media, and approaches. I could say a lot more, but I won't. So for this reason, I'm so very glad he's finally speaking as one of the featured presentations in Plasma, since he's been instrumental to bringing many of the guests over the last 4 years. So please join me in a microphone muted welcome to Ekrem Serdar.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm gonna hit press. Oh no! First, I'm gonna hit share screen. Oop. Share, and then I'm gonna hit present. Yeah, thank you, Paige, for having me, and thank you all of you for being here this evening. Yep, I'm Ekrem Serdar. I'm a white passing male with a beard and a haircut that I'm told is too short. I'm in a room with some fresh flowers behind me, and I dressed up pretty occasionally, mostly because I wanted to dress up. Today, I'm going to give you a rough timeline of my work, talk about Squeaky Wheel and the ways in which you may be you can get involved, and also sort of go through some of my background preceding Squeaky Wheel as well. I do want to mention that I am feeling somewhat low today. It was a lot sort of last night, sort of reading about Dante Wright's murder, so close to where George Floyd's, Derek Chauvin's trial is taking place. And, after weeks, I think of like sort of this breathless coverage of the blue wall of silence finally being broken. Like, wow, they're not lying, cops aren't lying for once. It's just, I think, sort of like another reminder that these sort of so-called tools of justice really just reinscribe white supremacy, and abolition is really just the only way. A friend of mine signs her emails, I hope all is well, all considered, which I think I've sort of taken on as a thing that I always say. So to all of you who are watching, I hope you are well, all considered. Much of this text is pre-written, so I'm going to read it as, that's what we're here for. But if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to send this to you afterwards or anything, please don't hesitate to email me. So I'm from Ankara, Turkey, but I was born in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. My father was in the Turkish Foreign Ministry, which meant that growing up was very similar to how a military bred is, sort of moving from place to place every couple of years. So when I was growing up, that meant that I was living in Turkey, a bit in the United States, where I learned English, and Germany for 4 years. I was almost always like not a very good student for a variety of reasons, through grad school actually. And I very much got into movies as a sort of escape in a lot of ways. And it was in high school that I met the playwright Mehmet Baydur, who was at the time sort of considered Turkey's foremost playwright. And he had an enormous sort of collection of Betamax tapes, with 3 or 4 films on every tape. His son was my classmate and a dear friend. So together, we would be watching Final Fantasy VII and playing Metal Gear Solid, and playing Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid while watching films by the Coen brothers and, Federico Fellini, among others. In this image, you can see one of the beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds that is in Final Fantasy VII that isn't part of the current remake, along with an image of Mehmet Baydur on the right, and who's joined on a sort of record table with the artist Ali Arif Arsan and the great short story writer Tomris Uyar. So in 2001, after high school, my father was able to afford sending me to the United States to study. And, UB at the time was relatively affordable, which was a real privilege. So I didn't have to deal with the Turkish university exams other than just passing them, along with the SAT and TOEFL, of course. And, fall 2001, it was only a couple of weeks into my time here that 9/11 happened. And I sort of witnessed this country become as enveloped and obsessed with flags as my own country was, and very much doubling down on its racism, insularity, imperialism. And of course, around that time was also the first of the Muslim lists, which is something I, of course, had to sign up for too. These were some moves that had a lot of familiarity to me, as Turkey acted somewhat similarly towards its people and neighbors who weren't Sunni Muslims. I think at the time I had originally started as a political science major, but my heart was really very much in film, and I began taking classes in the media study program. And with that also, at the time, and the United States entering Afghanistan and about to enter the war in Iraq, or begin the war in Iraq, I also find myself amongst a sort of activist and anarchist scene and hardcore scene, even though I don't know anything still really about hardcore music and mostly listen to jazz then. But this sort of led to my first dabblings in curating when a bunch of us opened up Access Community Info Shop. So this is an image of the info shop that is on Main Street near South Campus, right next to Just Pizza. It's currently a barber shop named Love is Love. Access Community Info Shop was a computer lab and event space with a free library, a free store, a bed carpet, a custom gray water sink system for our sink, and a big projector. So I started showing movies there, and I had no idea what I was really doing. I would just get a DVD of a Tarkovsky movie and show it. I didn't know or didn't think through questions around distribution or paying artist fees. And at the time, I think I just presumed like, hey, I have the DVD, I'm just going to show it. Around this time, a little after that, here, 1 second, I was feeding my cat in this room, and I have to let him out because he's meowing. Bye, kitty. Goodbye. At the time, just down the street, Talking Leaves Bookstore's Main Street location, which only recently closed, was there, and I would spend a lot of time there. And it's through that space and the people who work there that I started meeting people in Buffalo's poetry scene, and through them also the filmmaker Scott Puccio, and who's the first person who sort of got me involved in experimental cinema. He encouraged me to go to the New York Film Festival with him to see the views from the avant-garde section, which I did, and really introduced me to a world that I didn't think at the time I would be very interested in, as I was very hesitant about what seemed like these sort of very obtuse films that didn't quite make sense to anyone. But I dived right in and watched some films that completely changed me. And it was around this time that I'd gotten into grad school, and I went, straight from undergrad to grad, so I could avoid going to the Turkish military because, guns and nationalism are awful. And I received a graduate assistantship, which allowed me to afford it. And between Scott Puccio's influence and taking classes with Tony Conrad, Brian Henderson, and many others, I very much jumped into this world that I also felt like I needed to share. And it was at that time that I wrote my first grant application to pay artists and artist fees. And we brought Hollis Frampton's Hapax Legomena, a 4-hour-long series of films that had just been restored from one of the department's sort of most renowned faculty members, and with an introduction by Mike Zarid, and followed by a series of films called The Secret History of the Dividing Line by David Gatton. I didn't have any pictures of that day on my computer, but I recently gave a talk of Hollis Frampton, so yeah, that Hall Walls and John Massier made this very to me, amusing poster of it. Now, the thing with this experimental film scene at the time, at least, is that it was, of course, predominantly white. I would go to Views of the Avant-Garde, and I mean, of course, with a name like that, and I would meet so many amazing people, but it was common usually that I was the only person from Turkey. So I didn't really have anyone to talk to help me think through some of these ideas, aesthetics, visions that I was encountering in a way that I could connect it to Turkey's own history and visual culture. At the time, I joined a Yahoo listserv named Deneysel Cinema and asked a simple question: can I find a 16mm film projector in Turkey? And through that, I met a group of dear friends, and we started a blog named Küçük Sinemalar. The name for Küçük Sinemalar, meaning small cinemas, was a riff off of Tom Gunning's article Towards a Minor Cinema, that sort of was also riffing off of that one Deleuze article whose name I'll never remember, probably Towards the Minor Literature or something like that. But the idea for Küçük Sinemalar was that, we needed to create these intimate, small in scale, deeply impactful, politically engaged works, and that we needed to feature them together as a way to resist industrial narratives. We were all making films of the time. Many of us had gone to school in the States and being exposed to filmmakers like Frampton and Brakhage and so on. And we were all sort of very excited to find each other, to imagine sort of new futures also for what the visual culture of our country could look like. So we started doing screenings together, showing each other's work, curating together. Here's a picture of three of us, myself, Yoel Miranda, and Eitan İpeker, with the curator Fatma Çolakoğlu at the Pera Museum. And, you know, it was a good time. And what was most exciting at the time was, of course, the big hangouts also afterwards. This is a picture of a bunch of us after the screening that night. You know, the big table, right? And that's still something that really excites me. You share food, you might dance, you chat, and make fun of each other. You see your friends maybe sort of hang out together that you may not see otherwise. And you go deep into conversations you don't really sometimes even know how to stop. You have small asides, very sort of intimate conversations with someone, you know, while everyone else is sort of talking around you. You know, and I'm still driven by this in a lot of ways, and I still mark the big tables is still a way that I mark sort of my time through life in a way. In this photo, the filmmaker Yoel Miranda here made fun of me that I'm looking like I've never seen a camera before and I don't know what it is. We continued doing these events and screenings through many years, and I also did a number of screenings of Küçük Sinemalar's work in the United States as well. There was recently, I think, a year or two ago, a retrospective that FOL organized of a lot of our collected works, and sort of this is the poster for it and an installation image. And this took place on the Asian side of Istanbul at Bomonti, I believe. And at the same time, I was also, in addition to doing screenings of work of Turkish cinema here in the United States, I would also be taking films and projectors sometimes also to Turkey. So here I am wearing the same shirt that I'm wearing today. And I think in this picture, I was about to screen Anthony McCall's line describing a cone, which also requires a fog machine, and which was a really magical thing to do. Around, you know, this time of that last show, that's around like 2009, 2010, my wife got into grad school at UT Austin, so we moved to Texas. I didn't really know anyone in Austin at the time, but I knew the filmmaker Caroline Coble lived there, who was a professor of mine at UB. I also knew that the filmmaker Scott Stark, whose films I had seen at Views from the Avant-Garde some years before, was there as well. So the three of us, along with the filmmaker Rachel Stuckey, Jennifer Staub, who's a scholar and writer, the musician and curator Nayantara Bhattacharya, sort of at various capacities and at various times, started experimental response cinema, mostly to address a sort of dearth of experimental moving image work in Austin. Now, Austin, you know, you all probably know it from like South by Southwest, and it has a very strong film culture, but almost very specifically in exploitation film. So at the time, there was a real lack of like artist-made moving image works. So, you know, we came together, we wrote grants to the city, very DIY, we shared equipment, and we were supported by so many amazing organizations who would host us, from the Alamo Drafthouse to galleries like the Visual Arts Center, where some really inspiring people like Tommy Swenson and Sochi Solis worked respectively. And that's when I got really most seriously into curating, while doing sort of odd jobs post-grad school, from videography to building websites and working, you know, at a video store. This image that you're seeing right now is a screening of work by Sahakuncha, who's an absolutely amazing and crucial artist, and who passed away in the early 80s. Her works that we were screening that day were meant to be seen on CRT television. So we kind of took a cue from back when, before projectors were seriously stable, you know, like a lot of sort of these like screenings rooms would have like multiple televisions sort of screening the same work. So we took a cue from that to be able to screen the work in its sort of proper format and medium. This is the filmmaker, amazing filmmaker, Jesse Mclean, who we hosted as part of ERC. In 2015, my wife had graduated, and she's from Buffalo. Despite at the time very difficult, and now even more so, situation in Turkey, we were making plans to move there. So ahead of moving to Turkey, we decided to move to Buffalo and spend a year here. And I imagined I would still be working odd jobs, just spending some time with her family, when the curator position at Squeaky Wheel opened. I applied, and that brings us to the past 5 years. To those of you who might not be familiar with Squeaky Wheel, it's an organization that provides low-cost equipment rentals, media arts for youth and adults, and exhibitions, residencies, and public programs. We began in 1985, and by the story goes, dozens of people, many of them associated with the Department of Media Study, including Tony Conrad and Julie Zando, among others, wrote all of these grant applications to found Squeaky Wheel. It was to be able to continue to raise funds to buy expensive equipment together, right? So this is the 80s. Video editing equipment is extremely expensive and not very easy to come by. And to sort of share this equipment with each other, teach each other, and ensure also that public funds supporting media arts kept coming to Buffalo to support the scene. So this is Squeaky Wheels, I believe, I'm told, the first location, right off the corner of Elmwood and Potomac. You'll see that sort of like glass building on the south side of Potomac still. And from my understanding, this is where Squeaky Wheels' first location was. We are currently located downtown at the corner of Chippewa and Main Street in the Market Arcade building. This is a flyer that I found of some of the kind of educational things that we would do from 1994, a day of digital assistance. Come explore the world of online communication. Demonstrations will include the Buffalo Freenet and basic internet concepts, advanced Freenet use, networking, and more. Arts Wired, the Arts News and Information Network, the World Wide Web with Mosaic software, all free at the Buffalo County Library. And, it's great because I think at the time, this 1994 moment, we used to also publish this journal called The Squealer. There's an interview right from that time with Scott Stark from, who I had worked with at ERA Experimental Response Cinema, talking about sort of how to use the internet for early artists. So the focus with Squeaky Wheel was always on equipment rentals and education and residencies and sort of these big, fun, gnarly events. And when I had come on in late 2015, Squeaky Wheel had just moved into its current location, and with it, a very nice micro cinema and a white wall gallery space. At the time, I didn't really have any experience mounting exhibitions, except as volunteering with some galleries. But I had a lot of thoughts around thinking around time and attention as they relate to people who are sitting versus moving, and thinking through how people walk through spaces and artworks. So through my time here, we've had exhibitions with a number of artists, and each one of whom I've learned so much from Angela Washko, Sandra Perry, Black Quantum Futurism, Wenwashi, Kathy Hai. This is an image from Belit Sağ's exhibition, Let Me Remember. Belit is an artist from Turkey who currently lives in Amsterdam, and in collaboration with the film seminar, we presented her first US solo show, which also received an absolutely lovely review by Connor Moynihan in Art Forum, where it was a critic's pick. I keep pressing the wrong button, I'm sorry. The exhibition was focused both on a sort of history of visual culture, but also sort of focusing very much on a series of racist murders that took place in Germany by these sort of neo-Nazis targeting Turkish and Kurdish people who lived there. One of the most here's Bidit working with some of our students in a news and collage workshop. And, many of these students sort of continued utilizing these techniques in their own work as well. Sandra Perry had also taught a Blender class, and then the students began using Blender and making these amazing selfies with Blender. And, this aspect of Squeaky Wheel to me is always very moving, and seeing how an artist can sort of pass along their skills, their thoughts, their aesthetics to younger people. And I think is also what distinguishes Squeaky Wheel from a more traditional contemporary arts center. Education is part and parcel, and a sort of critical cutting edge media arts education for all is, I think, like a real promise of this organization. Here's an image from Sandra Perry's exhibition. Oh, and here's one of the 3D selfies that one of our students made. One of the sort of projects that I worked on for quite a long time as part of Squeaky, which I think those of you in the class may have read about, is Puncture's Textiles in Digital and Material Time. Squeaky received a Curatorial Fellowship for me to support me traveling and researching for this project, which came from out of the sort of intersections, historical, contemporary, political between textiles and media. When I just kept noticing all of these sort of moments where these two things that you might not associate together would intersect, whether it be Hollywood film producers hiring women to be editors because they saw it similar to stitching work, whether it be the actual technology of the projector itself be based around the same intermittent mechanism of a sewing machine, and also sort of more more sort of, for lack of a better word, emotional connections from watching Atom Aghayan's film Ararat, which is about the Armenian genocide and ends with a film with a shot of someone sewing. The exhibition featured work by Cecilia Vicuña, Betty Yu, Suzanne Kite, Charlie Best, Sabrina Geschwantner, excuse me, and along with many screenings and public events as part of it. And the exhibition is slated to travel to Space Gallery finally this summer in Portland, Maine. It began with this amazing, wonderful fashion show by Charlie Best, accompanying their wonderful installation in our window gallery titled "We Interrupt This Program." Here's an image of Suzanne Kite performing their work, "Everything I Say Is True." It came with we also commissioned a new work by the artist Eniola Davodu that was, I think, featured in Art Forum over this past summer, named Keresi Ekere, and that was made with support from the Creative Arts Foundation as part of the university. And, amongst all the many events, like, of course, again, sort of tying it also back to education, this is Betty Yu teaching a number of students how to use augmented reality in a workshop called Threading Roots, which is about sort of like investigating one's roots and heritage through AR. Now, I mentioned that Punctures was supposed to open at Space Gallery last year, and obviously that didn't happen for many reasons. The pandemic hit. When it hit, we transitioned to online programs. And as someone who very much thinks about how audiences interact with artists and vice versa, it provided a real challenge. I think the year previous, we had been doing a good amount of work, sort of creating Squeaky Wheels community guidelines, and also mapping the accessibility of Squeaky space. And here I also want to mention what an amazing resource and real gift to any of us presenting work is Carolyn Lazard's Arts and Accessibility, A Promise and a Practice, which I highly recommend. but it was kind, it was a moment adapting to that, to this new online moment, right? Moderation, right? This is a serious question. It wasn't long after when we, a lot of our organizations transitioned to online that we started hearing about Zoom bombing, but also questions around like intimacy, because, live chats just sort of scroll, like sort of passing each other in the night without necessarily like interacting with each other usually. Not everyone wants to be on camera. And I knew at the time I had to spend, several hours just sort of staring at a wall. And, there are certainly events I wouldn't be able to make on time. So we asked auditors if they'd be willing to let us share their works for a little more extended time so people could have like a little more time to watch them. And to provide perhaps a different way of interacting that is a bit more involved, we tried playing with Google Docs. This was with the filmmaker Miko Revereza, who, like the first time we tried to do it, me and Miko came up with some, he really wanted to participate in the Q&A following the screening of his film No Data Plan, but he was going to be on a bus at the time, so there was no way he could be on camera. So we set up the Google Doc together. We sort of made some rough rules for people to, make sure everyone, is cool. And he added a playlist for people to listen to. And after the film, I just started typing, and a lot of people started typing with me, chatting, adding pictures. And then Miko tuned in the next day and added pictures of himself and answered questions. And when people participate, it's still very magical to me. This is from, this one that we're seeing right now is from the Q&A following our last Animation Fest. And I see the curator of the Animation Fest, Tobias Lewis, is also in the event. Hi, Tabia, you're amazing. Like even just like this past week, to those of you who may have tuned in to our screening of Empty Metal with Adam Khalil and Bailey Schweitzer, there was a moment where me, Adam, and Bailey just started reading aloud a question while someone was typing it. And the anonymous person just like started deleting it, typing ha, deleting that, still trying to type their question. It was a sort of strange and charming and magical moment with like all of us sort of laughing on camera, and me also imagining them laughing, wherever and they might be typing that question in. This is a sort of brief GIF from interactive workshop we led titled What Would an Uprising Doula Do?, which was led by the group What Would an HIV Doula Do? Those of you who were part of Plasma last year may remember Catherine Chairs and Alejandra Yuhas. We invited them to be part to lead a interactive workshop together. That was really wonderful. Being far away from home in general and far away from each other has also been bringing a lot of sort of diasporic experiences to the fore of my mind as an immigrant. To those of us who are immigrants, refugees, and find ourselves in places where we are not from, there are certain parts of this new online life that are somewhat, old to us in a lot of ways. And it was sort of by coincidence, in a sense, that this past fall, we opened an exhibition with Public Visualization Studio, Imani Men and Patricio de Villa, titled Passing Through the Heart. This was originally supposed to be in person, but we transitioned it to a series of virtual cooking shows, along with this exhibition that you can see in this picture right now. But the event was the exhibition was specifically centered around thinking around transnational identity formation, data visualization, and cooking. This is an image of some of their animations from one of their episodes. And in this image, you can kind of both see the production of some of this work as well as the making of it. So this is one of the virtual cooking shows. And the way this happens is that here in this image right here, I'm not sure if you all can see my mouse cursor, but it's on the bottom, it's in the middle right square. You can see the artist Imani Men, who is using motion capture equipment while he cooks in front of a table. And you can see in the very middle square, you can see him cooking from a bird's eye view. In this episode, the artist Kalpana Subramanian is teaching Emily and Patricio, who you can see on the top left square, how to make green Italy with rice. So they would cook together over Zoom, and Emily's motions would be captured, and they would animate it later, as you can see on the top middle square, as well as the bottom middle square. And a lot of sort of thinking around that is both to sort of think around, you know, food and motion capture, but sort of very viscerally, like, how do I cut an onion? You know, do I cut it the same way my mother cuts it? What does it, you know, what is the exact movement that I'm doing, and what happens when we capture that movement? In this episode specifically, and you know, last night I was making Ramadan pide, and also happy Ramadan to anyone who celebrates it. But I was very much thinking of this episode of, you know, Patricio, Imani, both of whom are, you know, immigrants and refugees who've been living in Toronto for some time, sort of thinking around, you know, when you're sort of in this country named Canada, you know, what an important and visceral way of establishing continuity cooking is. And that's sort of where my thinking is still right now. And I think these are some of the topics also that we'll be sort of addressing more and more so in the next coming months as well. But I think this is a good place for me to switch from this slideshow, but also tell you a couple of ways in which you can also get involved in Squeaky Wheel. So, you know, the Clear portal is obviously our website. But the first things I want to mention is really much want to recommend you all go to the opportunities section. You know, a lot of amazing artists, you know, after they graduate, become teaching artists with us, you know, whether it be teaching sort of workshops for youth or adults. So that's certainly something I want to highly recommend. And if you're a student who's already been watching all of these great plasma artists, who's already been sort of being exposed to all of this deep critical work, then that's amazing. That's what, you know, one of the ways in which I want to make sure, you know, when I'm thinking of, like, you know, amazing artists like Sandra Perry sort of teaching youth and stuff, it's the same thing, right? Like, if you're already sort of like learning these amazing things, that to me, to be able to make sure that that gets passed on is a real joy. Along with that, we have an equipment access grant if you're an artist. This gives you about $1,000 of in-kind equipment rentals for project-based work. And that's rolling applications, so you can apply at any time. And then finally, we have one of our signature programs, which is the workspace residency. The residency, once you graduate, is an opportunity for artists and researchers to work on their projects. And it's 2 to 3 weeks. And we provide stipends and artist fees. And nowadays, we've also began offering funds for childcare and or disability support if requested. You know, the current sessions have been virtual. So we've also tried to sort of like, you know, match people with resources where they are too, but also provide them via mailing service and so on. And it's a really, you know, last week, you know, Jensen, of course, was one of our residents this past summer. I think one of our residents, Hane Utamura, is maybe sort of among the audience tonight. And, you know, it brings together, it's a way for you to meet other amazing artists. It's a way for you to focus on your work for a period of time. And, you know, we try to make sure that, you know, for me, one of my main sort of focuses with Squeaky Wheel has been sort of very much sort of, strengthening this bond between both Buffalo as well as sort of like the larger national as well as international scene, because it deserves the people who work here, including you all, deserve a play. You all deserve your work to go out, right? So if we can help facilitate that, then that makes me really happy. So that's a couple of things, and of course, I also want to. Another way is be a member. If you become a member, you get discounts on attending classes, you get discounts on renting equipment, and all sorts of other fun things. And if you sign up now, we also have a special where you get this beautiful new pin for free as well. So I recommend you check that out as well. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And so great to hear the full arc of your career. So I want to encourage people to raise their hand or just unmute yourself to ask a question. Students, public, Squeaky Wheel residents, former Squeaky Wheel residents, but also to encourage you to, if you don't want to speak, you can put your question in the chat, and Portland will read it out.
Looks like we've got a hand raised. Sean, do you want to ask?
Yeah, that was very interesting actually, because my brother and I are looking into sort of the field side of filmmaking. We make independent films and stuff. We've been making them for a while, and short films, and we made a feature film. Anyway, yeah. My question was what do your workshops entail? What is that more about in more detail?
Sure. I mean, it really depends. I think certainly when we were in person, it was something, anything from intro to Photoshop, intro to sound design, cinematography, advanced Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, so I think certainly when we go back in person, these are sort of things that I certainly highly recommend,
Yeah, thank you so much. I was going to say maybe whenever everything gets back to normal, I'll definitely like to meet up with you or ask more questions in person.
Sure. Definitely feel free to email me anytime.
Awesome. Thank you.
Do you want to just talk a little bit about the youth program? Some of the youth programs?
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
Not involved in them, but yeah.
Yeah. I'm not we have been sort of working on them, and they have been, shifting a little bit. But I think one of our sort of most exciting programs is our Saturday cafe program, which has been doing some really amazing work, specifically in Mozilla Hub spaces. But much sort of the image of Billy teaching our youth, we've been sort of trying to provide them with guest artists, and they're led by our amazing lead mentor Caitlin Lowe, along with Mark Longalugo. And the last session, I think, had students from both Buffalo as well as around, as it was virtual. But this current session, I believe, is entirely Western New York based. We've been doing a lot of education around for kids with autism. We've been doing workshops for Girls Who Code classes. So these are all sort of classes that I think we often are curious to hear about, for people who are interested in teaching them. So I definitely want to recommend, again, sort of look through our programs and, email, and even if it's not now, it's good to know when, that we know that there are people out there who are interested in teaching these things. So even if you don't see a class that you don't think you can teach, tell us what you think would be a useful class.
Yeah, no, it's a really amazing opportunity. It's also something that we don't always talk about that a lot of our grads, but also people with degrees in media study, that teaching youth media is a huge place to be working, not just at Squeaky, but in general. But Squeaky is an amazing place to actually get your first chance to have taught classes to high school students, to what's the age range? Is it also middle school students too?
It depends from the program. Usually, like our Saturday cafe is 13 to 19. But like our summer Tech Arts for Youth classes, which in person is like just like media camp for a youth, that's like a much broader range.
Yeah. Cool.
And there's a question in the chat about whether you could share some names of the artists you mentioned in the talk. Yeah, because there were so many great people you mentioned. So if you could share that somehow.
I will.
Hi, Ekrem.
Hi, Tabia.
I have, I guess, not a huge question, but I just wanted to know, like, what did some of your more earlier screenings, like when you were a baby curator, look like thematically? Because we've like never talked about that.
Yeah, it depended. Just so everyone knows, this is Tabia Lewis, one of our amazing curatorial intern, and who curated our past Animation Fest program. And I'm just enthralled with all the work that they do. I think oftentimes it was just out of sort of they weren't necessarily thematic in a sense. It was more like, I heard this person's films are really good. I want to see them. I started curating very much out of just like not necessarily because it seemed easier for me to do it myself rather than asking or bugging other people to do it. But I think the couple of thematic programs that I did do at the time were very much sort of like rooted in individual films that I wanted to showcase and trying to find the theme around that. There was one screening that included work by Jesse Mclean titled Katabasis, which was sort of like structured as like a journey through the underworld. But yeah, so it depended, but a lot of it was really just thinking like, wow, I hear Mary Helena Clark's work is amazing. I want to see all her films. I hear I know Michael Robinson's amazing. I want to see all his films. So it mostly revolved around that. And this also, I think, brings up another thing of like, it took me, I didn't necessarily think too much about a question because it was entirely like for me and the other people who really enjoyed this. I didn't think as much about the question of an audience and how to sort of like create a generous space with an audience as much as I did as I do now.
Do you feel like that happened because you also had to curate in space too? Like, so that somehow you became sensitized in different ways because you had these two different venues? I think it's such a great question about that thematic, right, and program and time-based versus space, curating for a physical space or now virtual space. Do you have, how do you feel like that evolved, that question about audience, but also that different thinking about themes or around an individual artist?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of your question. Could you repeat that?
I was just asking about how much did that, you're thinking about how to shape audiences, right? So that at first you said, there were certain artists you like to see and you couldn't see their films. So then you became the curator who said, I'm going to bring this person and their films, or just their films. But it sounds like in your first few rounds, that was as important to have the artist there as it was to see the film, so that the artist could talk about it. And so then my question is, how did that shift into you starting to think about audience and how to create audience? Or was that did they happen at the same time?
I think it happened more the more I got dissatisfied with a certain way in which experimental moving image art and or contemporary art is presented. Like whether it be the art form ads that just have a bunch of names you've never heard of, which is fun, if you know them, great, right? But I think it was sort of thinking around and also talking with artists about who these works are for. So it did happen concurrently with me sort of taking on, going from a DIY curator to an institutional position. But also, yeah, I think what sort of drove me more was just sort of getting mad at a certain insularity, perhaps. Because if you're not an art, we all know this, right? Some of our first art experiences are super alienating. You walk into a gallery, you don't know, what's going on. This is one of the reasons why I wasn't that interested in experimental film, because I was just what are these people even talking about? But there is a lot of lovely things here, right? And and it's just something that you navigate as you do. But there's certain things that we can, sort of provide for audiences, sort of enjoyable breadcrumbs, I think, that people can follow and be oh, okay, so this is a welcoming space, this is a way to sort of engage. So I think that's it was sort of thinking around those sort of things.
Cool. And we have another question in the chat from Liz Park. I'm just going to read it out because there's a few in here. So she says, thank you for the talk. And can you tell us about how Squeaky Wheel came to write and share the community guideline? What was the motivation? What was the process like? How did the Squeaky Wheel community respond to it when it was introduced? I personally appreciate it very much.
What was the process like? I think I'm trying to remember. I think it was sort of sensing, at least certainly in my experience, and also criticisms that I had heard from artists and so on, of certain white audience members occasionally taking up too much space. And then there were certainly times, at least sort of, again, just sort of speaking on my behalf, where I wasn't present and wasn't being able to be a good moderator at the time. So I know there were some I at the time I remember thinking it'd be good for us to have something, but it most sort of concretely took place when we had I think it was our 2019 Love and Sex show, which was guest curated by Dames Making Games, which is an amazing group based in Toronto. And I think I remember. Now, the Love and Sex show, for those who don't know, is a sort of Valentine's bash that is about sort of love and intimacy. And, I think at the time we wanted to ensure okay, how do we create a safe space in which these interactions can generously occur? And Dames Making Games has an amazing code of conduct. They have amazing sort of community guidelines. Our current community guidelines are sort of based both on theirs as well as Sugar Cities. But it's also a work in progress. In terms of how people have responded to it, from my understandings, positively. It's I think I see artists usually sort of like thanking us when we sort of go through and introduce them to an event, that there are community guidelines and we talk about the sort of moderation process. So my understanding has been very that it's been helpful for our events. We've thankfully, knock on wood, haven't had any issues online so far. So that's been great. Hope that answered your question, Liz, but happy to talk about it more if you do.
Cool, and there's another question in the chat from Hamadi, sort of about the effects of COVID in this past year. How did the audience, Squeaky Wheel community, react to the new mode of curation online? Did audiences appreciate the new format, or do you feel there is a longing to return solely to in-person presentations and curated programs, or maybe there's going to be a hybrid that comes out of this?
My hope is certainly a hybrid. I think there's a certain, even though Squeaky Wheel is located downtown, which is one of the few places in the city where all of our bus lines can go, Buffalo is not a very accessible city in any way, right? And along with that, it's been really nice for me personally seeing both people I know in Buffalo, including many of the people who I see attending tonight, but also people from all over attend. And knowing that, like a friend of mine in San Francisco and a friend of mine in Buffalo are here in the same Google Doc together, and so that's been really like exciting for me. Even though, of course, at the end of the, I think it's early on in COVID, like the Zoom would turn off and I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm in my room, but that's become less of a thing. And in terms of how, I think I've only heard positive things. But yeah, if people have not had positive experiences, I would love to hear about it too. Of course, there's things there are certain events that you can't do online. There are certain performances that we had to cancel because they, just would not make sense in this sort of format. And that's okay. Like, we'll have time. I'm hopeful. Maybe.
I'm gonna encourage people to raise their hands or just unmute themselves if they have a question. I know that a lot of students had questions about this distinction between dealing with the materiality of film versus the kind of immaterial character of it, and your perspective on that. But I think Connor has a question. He wants to unmute.
Sure. This is more a question just about Squeaky Wheel. Is there like any specific kind of work that you guys look for when you're doing partnerships with artists or students, or is it just whatever work those people are doing that you help out with?
It depends on the program. Like I think for like the residency program, we are looking for people working critically across content and aesthetics, whether it be them making documentary works, whether them making sort of more experimental works, installations, sound works, video games. I think for something like our equipment access project, I think that could be somewhat because that's so much more that's much more project-based, and it depends on the kind of project that I think you would want to do. I don't necessarily, it's certainly like I think more artist-focused in the sense that I think if you're like, hey, I need something to help make a commercial with, like I don't necessarily, it depends, So but I think these are, if there are, it's easier for me to speak to it if there are specific examples.
Fair enough. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a follow-up for that was put in the chat that is sort of about, do your services encourage narrative film as well?
Sure. Again, I think the best way to get a sense is certainly going to our website and looking to our exhibition archive, right? Because you're going to see so many works with the narrative works in there, right? It's not a question of genre or approach as much as at least on the curatorial end of things, having a certain critical approach. That being said, the people can rent equipment from us at any time for any project that they want, because that's what we're here for. People can take classes with us for whatever projects that they want. That's what we're here for. But as a curator, as doing the sort of just the exhibitions part, that's the kind of sort of work that I think is Squeaky Wheels' mission, and that's how I'm sort of interpreting it.
Can I ask you a hard question of to say more about what you mean by critical?
Sure. No, it's a very good hard question, and I've spent many a time trying to write it out. I think there's many of the works that Squeaky Wheel has showcased through both its huge history as well as the kind of work that I think that I've been able to do brings with it an politically engaged approach to history, a desire for the future to be radically different than what it is today, and an approach to material that wants to go beyond just sort of tropes and cliches and common uses. Not all of these together necessarily, but certainly a sort of real dissatisfaction with business as usual.
That's great, right? So the idea, so the terms, it's just interesting because I think sometimes we hear the term alternative, right? But critical is, has a different relation than alternative to what? And you're saying critical to the medium, to the history, to the present, to the future, all of these things. It's critical to all of them. It's not alternative, right? It's critical.
Yeah. And very much, yeah, absolutely. And it's decenter, sort of more harmful dominant modes.
Ask you another one, which is, do you have any suggestions about how you encounter and find new work, and how do you, because you really, I'm always amazed at how you're a year ahead of the rest of the world, in terms of just the people that you connect with and bring through Squeaky and through Plasma. I have benefited, our students have benefited so much from your networks and your exposure and your curiosity and commitment to finding, to not reinscribing the dominant. So can you talk a little bit about how you do that and practices you suggest for students of finding new voices, critical voices? And I'm sure it's changed over time, but.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I follow very much, I feel like I follow in the footsteps of a lot of amazing curators and writers and other artists. Like there are venues that there are many curators who I follow and who I greatly respect, whether it be Lumi Tan at the Kitchen or, all the folks who work at the Black Star Film Fest, the Flaherty Seminar, of course, projections at the New York Film Festival. Eileen Nash is brilliant. Rachel Rakes at Bach. And so a number of these folks were residents too. It's this past fall we screened the work of Jordan Lord, who's been an absolutely amazing artist for me to. I had heard their name before, but I hadn't sort of like looked them up. And Emily Watlington, one of our residents, who's a writer for Art in America and a curator, sort of first presented on their work, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I highly recommend Jordan Lord's work. Their film Shared Resources is sort of playing around at various festivals right now. So, I know Emily and Jordan just released writing about Jordan's absolutely wonderful film After Access. I'll put that in the chat for sure, because I'm a huge Jordan Lord and Emily Watlington fan. It's really, a lot of it is like, just sort of following like others and just trying to listen and being like, hey, what have you been watching? I think one thing I would recommend for there's another side of it, which is just like the digging, like in the sense of like going through the archives and that's always a lot of fun. I've always, I enjoyed limited archives. Like I actually really enjoyed the Department of Media Studies 16mm archive, because it's only 300 films, but I know I haven't seen about 100 of them. So I'm like, ooh, what are these 100 films? And there might be just like bad documentaries or something, but I still want to know what they are, because I know they're like right there. So if I wanted to bring a 16mm film print and I wanted to show it, maybe it's in good shape, maybe it's an amazing film that I've never heard of before. I know I enjoyed doing that a lot when I was like first moved back to Buffalo, and I was sort of going through the department's 16mm film archive. And then of course, people are on social media, so just follow in social media.
Is there anything that you're like watching or have been following right now that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah. No. There's I just watched there's a new film festival based out of New York named Paige. Do you know what I'm talking about? I can't remember their name off the top of my head. It's like hosted by the Male Cinema as well as Screen Slate. I have to Google this right now. But one artist whose Q&A, a couple Q&As I attended recently with is Tiffany Shaw, who made the film Never Rest Unrest, as well as this, actually it just arrived today, this beautiful book named Too Salty, Too Wet. Her film Never Rest Unrest is about specifically the Hong Kong protests. But it's a sort of anti like it very much sort of refuses to show certain kinds of violence, but Q&As with her have been like very, very inspiring to me. And there's one on Instagram Live that I want to find and put in the chat at some point. the way she talks specifically about politics of distance, and yeah, so her work has been really exciting lately. There it is. And then let me find this festival. Prismatic Ground. There it is. I'll just link to their Q&A if I can find it.
I want to encourage students to ask questions. Anyone.
Can you think of maybe some of your favorite moments? I'm sure you've had rewarding moments of getting to like bring people and have them, talk about your work, and you talk about having the big table, the big get-togethers afterwards, which unfortunately we haven't been able to have this past year. But I love those kind of things too, when you're just getting to sort of chat afterwards. So yeah, do you have any sort of favorite moments or funny moments from those?
I think certainly a big favorite was the 20 actually our last Love and Sex show, because there was lots of karaoke, and there was singing and dancing. We didn't have a big table, but we had Desiree Key perform. We had some amazing films. Caroline Doherty, I know, right? It was so much fun. But so the Love and Sex show has always been a lot of fun because it's, because it's a curated program, it can bring together a lot of people. I think the 2018 one, where Margaret Ree was a part of, Yvette Granada was a part of, we had George Jacodi, who's a performer based in Greece. He did a live Skype performance. So it was like 4 a.m. in Athens, Greece, and they like zoomed at us. Bhakti Brown, who was a student with one of our youth programs, they and their friends like made a film for the event. So that was so that was the last time I remember having a big table. That was very memorable. Yeah, and I feel like Paige, you were there too with like Pooja and stuff, and a number of other amazing people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was thinking about was that students don't necessarily, without a kind of sort of this experience of going to the quote unquote experimental cinema, the idea of curation and of these these questions of the thematic program versus the artist program, the idea of what it's like to put together a series of shorter films, what that does, and that it's kind of like making a film in itself. You're thinking about where you start, what's going to happen over the course of the hour and a half. When are people going to get bored? When are people going to need to get more engaged? Where do you put the tougher piece? How do you end? And then also, like you're saying, so then that's just the content of a program, right? Of a thematic or a different kind of putting together of lots of short pieces or a few short pieces, where we watch, the general viewing now is that you're choosing your own on Netflix, which is really based on the algorithm that's already working off what you chose before. so hard to find things in the beyond the what they're showing you to watch, right? But this idea of actually doing this work of thinking through the arc of an hour and a half, right? I don't know, it's a question for you too, of like, how long do you think is too long, or what's your sense of the attention span and has that changed in the years you've been doing this, or does it but so there's that question just about the mechanics, because I think that it's not until you start crossing over into this place of going to see young filmmakers or experimental filmmakers, critical filmmakers in these minor spaces, the idea of a group of films put together and curated in this way, right? We're used to this term, but it's very specific to, some people like to call themselves programmers, right? As opposed to curators. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little about that. I mean, I think this is part of what earlier question was, but just to even, because I was just thinking there's students, I mean, I know that I didn't have any idea that this was a kind of practice, or this is how, you could go and see 10 people's work one night and they had a relation to each other. It wasn't just like open call.
No, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you asking that, because you're absolutely right. Yeah, like I think without encountering that at a festival, it's really, or at a micro cinema, it's so in terms of duration, I like the Roger Corman duration, 83 minutes. That's that's like a top, I know there's a lot, and that's like really, it should be like real maximum, like I think 50 minutes to an hour usually is pretty good for a curated program. I don't necessarily know if that, I've certainly also done extremely long programs before. I once did a 2.5 hour program, and I was like, there's no other way I can do this. But I think I shouldn't have made it as long as I had. This was back in ERC days, I think. And in terms of the process of doing it, certainly rhythm. Like I remember when I was first sort of getting exposed to like experimental, like people who would do these sort of curated programs, like I'd hear about programmers of like, oh man, like this person watched these 10 films in different orders like 60 times until they got it right, or I'm like, oh my God, I'm, like, and I do remember being impressed by that, though it felt like a little like, too much perhaps, but certainly a sense of rhythm, certainly a sense of like, how might a short, how can the films sort of be in relation to each other and give each other strength and context rather than either disappear or actually harm each other in relation. I think like one of the most common things is like if a piece is really long, it's more likely it'll be towards the end, because if you program a really short work after a really long work, it's more likely that an audience might not think about the short work right after, sort of like some sort of basic things that I sort of think through. It's and that's also part of like talking with artists and seeing what commonalities they might have with other artists that you're thinking of. Or they tell you what artists that they might also be thinking of, I don't know if that answers your question, but like, some floating thoughts.
We are nearing the 83-minute mark. So I could have really asked it, but just so I do want to encourage people. I know that Anna Chimay has a question in the chat, but get your hand up. We'll probably take 2 more questions.
Yeah, so Anna's question is, thank you for sharing your thoughts and practice with us. You are also a talented writer. I'm curious, what are you researching and writing about now? And also, what poets are you reading?
Back at you, Anna Shimei. I have been doing research about the 1901 exposition, specifically around 1901, and of course McKinley's assassination here in Buffalo, and also with McKinley being for at least I think a little while sort of seen as like one of the more imperialistic presidents in the United States, from my understanding, right? Because like it was only a couple of years before that the U.S. became the colonial power in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, so I have been sort of thinking through the 1901 exposition a little bit, as well as ghosts, and thinking around early cinema practices. How do these sort of early cinema practices sort of align or don't align with colonial mindsets of the time? Sort of thinking around sort of like early visual history, culture, and so on. And in terms of what poets I'm reading, I have here actually one person who I keep coming back to is Mclean, who teaches at UB, as some of you may know. Her work is absolutely amazing. So she has a poem called I've read it at least 20 times and I still don't remember the title. I'm sorry. But yeah, anything by Mclean is wonderful. So I highly recommend it.
Sorry, maybe it's a little bit too late to give question. Hello, Ekrem. Thank you for a great talk. Yeah, I had like question, yeah, from a kind of conversation we had once that I remember when we met, you mentioned that you were initially thinking of majoring political science when you came to United States, but then September 11th happened, and then I was always then you decided to choose major media arts, and I've been always curious about that, because I think to me like media arts also have this maybe functional of maybe finding alternative strategy for political actions, or maybe has a function of historical archive. But I was just really curious, like how did this leap? I could find a connection, but I wanted to hear about that. Yeah, you need.
Sure. That's honey somewhere, one of our spring residents. Hi, honey.
Hi.
No, thank you. And I think this is a similar question that also came up in some of the questions I received from students too. One of the I think there is I think for a certain time period, I was thinking of the political impact of films in a very narrow way, in the sense of, has it passed any laws? And there are films and or artworks that have spurned on laws and or have named laws. I know in Belgium, the Dardenne brother film, is it Rosetta? Is that the name of the film? I think there's a child labor law that is sort of named after their film. And of course, The Jungle is often credited with passing sort of laws around the manufacturing of meat and labor. I also really like something Jensen Leonard, our summer resident, said last week about that when he sort of looks at his memes, and all of these memes sort of talking about abolition, and you know, sort of these like lefty memes or something, you know, like that they have an impact, you know, that they have been sort of like priming us for these for some of these moments. So, you know, I do. Yeah, I think I was telling you, you know, like I stopped being a political science major because I was getting really annoyed in my like American History 101 class. You know, I was just like so bored, you know, and it wasn't very immediate. You know, and of course there are many filmmakers who, you know, like Betty Yu, who I showed that image earlier of leading that AR workshop, whose works are very much intended. You know, I think when I had asked her, like, you know, it's like, this is about agitation, you know, and, you know, I think that has a lot of value for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to shout out Sindhu Tirumalai Sami, whose films are also amazing, and I can't wait to listen to her talk next week too.
Great. Yeah. So tune in next week to hear Sindhu come and talk and about her practice. And yeah, so thank you so much, Ekrem. Yeah, and for all that you have given to plasma over the years. So I really appreciate it, and all the artists you've brought. So I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll see you all next week.